Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. We'll just give folks a second to go ahead and get logged in. And while we are waiting for folks to join, just wanted to make everyone aware of resources that are available. So on your Zoom menu, you should see a resources tab. And if you click on that resources tab, you should see the CDE box link to download the presentation materials. We will also be putting it in the chat for everyone to see. So the link is available there. For those of you that have not ever used CDE box link, it will prompt you to, or ask you if you want to create a box account, and you do not have to create a box account. Okay, that's, you should be able to download the materials by just clicking that link, and it should give you the ability to download. You do not have to create a box account. It'll go into your downloads folder. So please take the time to do that. It's the PowerPoint as well as the technical assistance guide and our frequently asked questions. So make sure you take the time to do that. Thank you for joining us on this afternoon. Okay, and we'll just give it another couple minutes because we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to join. And just for those of you that had colleagues that were not able to join at this time, just know that we will be posting the recording of this video. We will be sending out the link through the SPED data support listserv, or the CDE SPED support listserv. So we will be letting you know once the video has been posted. All right, we're at about 580. Once we get to about 600 participants, we will go ahead and get started. Alex, I do see your question. How long is today's meeting? We're hoping that it will go just about an hour. It just really depends on the number of questions that we get at the end of the webinar. But it's scheduled to go for about an hour, potentially hour and a half, depending on questions. Okay, so we're at 600 participants. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Brandy Howdigy, and we're going to be walking you through the IEP implementation data collection for the 2024-25 academic year. I also wanted to introduce my colleague who will be co-presenting with me, Christopher Williams. He is a research data specialist in the Data Evaluation and Analysis Unit. And as I said, my name is Brandy Howdigy. I'm an Information Technology Supervisor for the Data Evaluation and Analysis Unit. Here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to be talking about a description and the requirements of the IEP implementation data collection. We're going to go over the timeline, the procedure and methodology. Then Chris is going to actually walk you through screens for the data collection website, and he's going to talk about some of the data validation and certification requirements. So if you have questions, we would ask that you post your questions in the Q&A box. Many of you like to post questions in the chat, and you do have the ability to type in the chat, but we ask that you limit typing your questions in the, or excuse me, you limit typing your questions in the Q&A and leave the chat for commentary or having conversations with your colleagues. Okay, so if you have general comments, please put them in the chat. If you have a specific question that you want addressed, please type it in the question and answer box. You will also notice that as a participant, you have the ability to upvote on a particular question. So if you see something that one of your colleagues has asked and you want to move it a little higher in the queue, you can give it the little thumbs up and it will answer that question based on the number of people who think that that question is important. All right, so what is the objective of the IEP implementation data collection? Well, first and foremost, it's to fulfill CDE's monitoring and enforcement responsibilities under IDEA. Second, it's to identify, and this is really important, systemic issues that LEAs may have in issues that are causing the LEA not to be able to provide services that are prescribed in a student's IEP. And then third, we have to actually identify and categorize those IEPs that were surveyed based on 3 designated percentages of completion ranges, which we will talk about in a little bit. So here's our timeline for the 24-25 data collection. Today is February 26th, and we are doing our training webinar. Now, the date range for IEP review, what does this mean? It means that when you receive your student samples and the SSIDs that you have to review their IEPs, you must review those IEPs from the dates March 3rd through April 30th, 2025. So what you're looking for are services that were in those students' IEPs and prescribed, agreed to by the parent, for IEPs that were effective during March 3rd through April 30th, 2025. The data collection window, when does the system actually open so that you can start submitting these data? The data collection window is May 1st through June 30th. Okay, so you have 2 months to submit your aggregate IEP implementation data collection data. The final due date is June 30th, 2025. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the procedure and methodology. So on May 1st, CDE is going to provide a random sample of students with disabilities to each LEA based on the following criteria. And it's really based on the number of students with disabilities that are enrolled at that time. And they had to have been enrolled during the entire range of IEP evaluation. They had to have been enrolled, and let me just go back one slide. They had to have been enrolled between March 1st and April 30th, and they had to have been enrolled during that entire period. On May 1st, we're going to generate SSIDs based on the most current data in CalPADS. And if you had a certain number of SSIDs, you are required to review a certain percentage of IEPs. So if you had 1 to 100 students with disabilities, the percentage of IEPs that you're required to review is 20 to 100%. If you have 101 through 199 students with disabilities, then you're required to review 10.05 through 19.8%. If you have 200 through 4,999 students with disabilities, you're required to review 10% of those students' IEPs. And then 5,000 and over, you are required to review 0.74% to 9.97% with a maximum of 500 for those LEAs. Now, what I should tell you is that small LEAs, okay, and that is LEAs with 100 or fewer students with disabilities that were selected for monitoring in cycles A, B, or C, are only required to submit IEP implementation data during their selected monitoring cycle. So this year, small LEAs in cycle B will be required to submit IEP implementation data. This is the 24-25 submission, and cycle B, small LEAs will be required to submit these data. So they will receive a random sample of SSIDs, and they will be required to review those IEPs. The other thing I should note is for all other large LEAs, okay, and those are LEAs with more than 100 students with disabilities. Those LEAs, when we generate that random sample of SSIDs, that random sample is not going to include any charters that you authorize that are in cycles A, B, or C. Okay, so you should only receive SSIDs related to your LEA and any charters that are not identified as small LEAs. And once again, folks, just a reminder, please type your questions in the Q&A and we will address them. My staff will try to address them during the duration of the webinar. And at the end, we can address any questions that still remain in the Q&A box. Okay, so there are some criteria that you should look for in your student sample. So those SSIDs that we send you. So first of all, like I told you, that sample should not include any students from charter schools identified as small LEAs that are being monitored in cycles A, B, or C. Okay, now this will include any charters that are not selected, excuse me, in those monitoring cycles. Second, the student sample should only include students enrolled for the entire duration of that evaluation period. So from March 3rd to April 30th. So this is a very good opportunity, folks, for you to work with your CalPADS administrators to make sure that any students who have exited and will be exited before March 3rd, that those exit records are submitted up to CalPADS. Because remember, we're going to pull data and generate that random sample in the beginning of May. And we're going to look at that enrollment period and look at all students based on CalPADS data that look like they were enrolled. So if you haven't submitted up your exit records, you may get SSIDs for kids who weren't enrolled during that period. So right now is a really good time to work with your CalPADS administrators to make sure that your enrollment records are up to date. The sample should also only include students on individualized education programs. Okay, it should not include students on individualized service plans, ISPs, or individualized family service plans. Now, if you do receive an SSID for a student who was not enrolled during the entire evaluation period, the first thing you need to do, just like I said, is make sure that CalPADS is updated. Make sure that enrollment has been exited in CalPADS. And second, you want to notify your SELPA that you won't be reviewing that SSID because they were not enrolled during the evaluation period. So just make sure that your SELPA is aware that you are removing that particular SSID from the sample. Excuse me, let me just grab some water real quick. Okay. Now, LEAs are expected to collect and analyze local service implementation data. So what does that look like? It's any data in your special education data system, taking attendance, staff attendance. It's a variety of things, but the expectation is that you will analyze local level data, and then the measurements are going to be based on a numerator and denominator. So the numerator is the total number of service minutes provided for all services prescribed in the, all services received in the IEP. And then the denominator is going to be the total number of service minutes that were prescribed. So it's all minutes prescribed. Numerator is all the actual service minutes provided. Then each student's IEP ratio is going to be summarized into one of three categories. So 100 to 95% of services implemented, which is where you want your kids to be. Then B, 94.9 to 90% of IEP services implemented. And C, less than 90% of IEP services implemented. Right, so more specifically, let's talk a little bit more about the numerator and denominator. So the numerator should include the total count of actual service minutes received for all services prescribed during the evaluation period. So what did they actually receive? The denominator, which is where it gets a little bit sticky, okay, it should include the total count of prescribed service minutes included in the special education plan, Again, the parent has to have agreed to that specific IEP, and that includes not only the service minutes that the student actually received, but it's also services that were prescribed but were not received due to student absences, and that includes familial or student illnesses, truancy, or other excused or unexcused absences. And it should also include any services not received because of staff absence or staff shortages. Now, there are some modifications that you can make to that denominator. You can exclude the following: minutes not received due to field trips, scheduled school breaks or intersession, statewide testing periods, student benchmark testing, any special program at the sites, for example, school assemblies, or any school-related emergencies. You can remove those from the denominator. Now, inevitably, a lot of you are going to have this question, which is, why do we have to count student absences in the denominator? And what I want you to do is just kind of take a step back and think that, or remember that we're providing you a sample of SSIDs. Okay, so CDE is examining the overall percentage of students in that randomly selected sample. Okay, if the majority of those students are falling in the below 90% range, then it may identify some systemic issues, and that will offer CDE the opportunity to provide programmatic and technical assistance. So really, we're looking at only those LEAs where a majority of their students actually fall within that category. All right, so let's take a look at an example here of how this would be calculated. So our sample LEA in this case is ABC USD. So this happens to be a large LEA. It's got over 5,000 students with disabilities. So the number of IEPs that they would be required to review is 500. Now let's look at a calculation for a single student. So again, the time period for analysis, we're looking at that student's IEP between March 3rd and April 30th and the services prescribed during that period. So in this case, there were 2,000 service minutes provided. There were 2,160 service minutes prescribed for that student. So in this case, this student falls into the 93rd percentile, okay? And so this student is going to be added to category B, 94.9 to 90% of services implemented. All right, so some things that you need to consider when you're evaluating IEP implementation. Okay, number one, it's really important that you have a clear documented process for tracking the implementation of IEP services throughout the year in preparation for any audits. Okay, so have a process documented. What are all the things, what are all the bases that you need to cover when you're looking at whether or not students' services have been received? If you use an electronic tracking system, a service tracker, you need to have a really clear understanding of how your special education data system tracks those services and how you can extract data to inform the IEP implementation data collection. Also, make sure all service providers are clear on their obligation to provide services consistent with the IEP. Okay, make sure everybody is aware of the student's IEP and what their piece is in providing those services and ensuring that those services are provided. Now, when you are determining the IEP implementation rates, you need to consider the following sources when you're looking to see whether or not a student's services have been actually received. You need to consider electronic or paper service logs, transition services prescribed and received. If you have any push-in or pull-out aid services, it's really important to know who's responsible for documenting those services prescribed and actually received. Make sure that you're counting and taking into account specialized academic instruction, student absences, and service provider or staff absences. Those are all of the things that you need to take into consideration. So how are specialized academic instruction minutes calculated? Well, if the student is present and in attendance, then you can count the service's SAI minutes as having been received. Okay, and this includes when you have an appropriately authorized, certificated, or licensed staff member substituting for the teacher of record. Okay, you can count those SAI minutes. Now, compensatory services. Students can receive compensatory services, but in order for those compensatory services to offset services received in the IEP implementation data collection, those compensatory services must have been received within that evaluation period, which is between March 3rd and April 30th. As a requirement of the court, CDE is required to assess the validity and reliability of the data submitted through the IEP implementation data collection. Okay, so the following reflects the methodology for the 23-24 and 24-25 academic years. Many of you might have realized that we have not yet issued the follow-up survey for the 23-24 IEP implementation data collection cycle. That survey is still forthcoming. And that is going to use the same methodology as we did in the prior year, which is we're going to randomly select 10% of LEAs that submitted data in the 23-24 IEP implementation data collection, and we will send you a survey. And that survey is about 5 questions long. It takes about 5 minutes to complete. And if you receive that email and you're one of those 10% of LEAs, you are required to return the results. So we will be following up if you do not submit that survey. Now, for the IEP implementation data collection that you are doing this year, when we do the follow-up survey after the data collection is complete, we will be using a new methodology that was approved by the court this last October. Okay, so here's the change. The change is that it's not just 10% of LEAs that submitted the data collection. It's now we're looking at 10% of LEAs from each of the following categories. So if a majority of your students fell into the 95 to 100 percentile, a majority of your students fell into the 90 to 94.9% percentile, or the less than 90%. We're going to be selecting randomly 10% from each of those categories and sending you the follow-up survey. So more LEAs will be receiving that survey. And the point of that, by the way, is to get a better idea of the things that LEAs are doing that fall in the higher percentages as compared to the methodology that LEAs are using if they fell in the less than 90%. So we're going to be evaluating those categories against one another. So how does this factor into your annual monitoring determinations? So you may have noticed in the February 4th, 2025 annual determination letter that went out, there was an IEP implementation flag that was put into the annual determinations. And in those data sheets that we sent out, there was a column for IEP implementation. LEAs were flagged as target not met if more than 50% of their student sample was marked in the bucket as receiving less than 90% of their prescribed services. Okay, and that is the way it will continue. So if more than 50% of your sample fell into that category, you were flagged as target not met. Okay, so I think I'm going to pause here for some questions before Chris goes into the actual screenshots. Okay, how do we find out which small LEA cycle we're in? So I would recommend that you send in a ticket to, I don't really, Joe or somebody, do you guys know the Smalls FMTA email address? Or should we just funnel it through SPED data support? And if you're talking, I cannot hear you.
Brandy, it's Carmen.
Right, but is there a general email address for Smalls FMTA?
Looking at cyclical smalls on the CDE webpage, she's listed as the contact.
Okay, why don't we just funnel it through SPED data support at CDE? We'll just do that, and then we can forward the email. All right. So send in an email to that, and then we will try to get an answer for you. Okay, Benet, if a small is in large sim for 2024, will they need to complete the IEP implementation? So Benet, I think I need a little more clarification. So has the small been identified for a particular cycle, or are they being considered a large LEA? And you can comment on the question. I just changed the settings. So if you need to comment on the question, Benet, to clarify it, I can come back to that. Okay, Meg Bristow at 111. Will small LEAs that are in cycle A or C need to participate in IEP implementation monitoring if they were found to be disproportionate this year? So no, the only time that small LEAs are required to submit IEP implementation data is when they are in their monitoring cycle. So this year, cycle A and cycle C will not submit IEP implementation data, only LEAs in, or small LEAs in cycle B. Okay, Benet, they are DISPRO and did SIM for 2024. They never did small LEA. So Benet, if you want to go ahead and send in a SPED data support ticket, we can check for you. Because that is a really good question. And we want to make sure that if they're not required to do IEP implementation, that they don't get the student sample, and we don't have to remove them from one of the participating LEA. So if you could just send a ticket, or you can email me directly, that's fine. Right? Are we still getting dinged for students who are absent, even though we were ready, willing, and able to offer the service? If so, is the state reviewing this because we get dinged on this, on attendance and IEP implementation? So I don't I don't like the word dinged. We're trying to identify. So the answer to your question is, if the student was absent and they were prescribed services during that period, yes, those are included in the denominator. However, dinged is it's more an opportunity to assist the LEA in help with what may be systemic issues. And again, remember, Travis, we're looking at your student sample, and it really only matters for monitoring purposes if more than 50% of your kids fell in that category. So it's a pretty large percentage, and there were not a whole lot of LEAs that actually fell into that category. So, and again, it requires specific monitoring activities. It requires the LEA to actually do the data drill down, to actually evaluate how they're doing IEP implementation. I mean, what are the data sources that you're using, et cetera. So But yes, that it does include students who were absent and were prescribed services during that time. Okay, anonymous also for cycle B. Not sure what that is in reference to, anonymous attendee at 112. So if you could clarify what you're talking about, that would be great. Okay, anonymous at 114. We are in cycle B and are submitting a student record review by February 28th. On top of that, we will still get another student list for implementation monitoring through June 30th. Yes, this is a requirement of the court. We are required to collect data on IEP implementation. Anonymous at 115. Why can't LEAs report absences separately from actual plan implementation results? We understand needing to identify systemic issues, but student absences are just one of a variety and may not necessarily lead to a reviewer to causation. And you will notice that we actually do not collect the reason the student did not receive their services. We do not currently collect that. And one of the primary reasons, folks, is the more data we collect, the more CDE has to intervene in certain circumstances, right? So we're trying to collect data that satisfies the requirements of the court. And again, if students are not receiving their services because of absences, it's not explicit, but as you're doing the data drill down, if you're one of those LEAs that were actually flagged for IEP implementation, as you're doing the data drill down, discussing some of those issues during that monitoring process is probably a good thing to do. But currently, that is the requirement, that we include student absence. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn this over to Chris because we are at 1:32. We're at about the halfway point. We will get to the rest of your questions. By the way, if we don't get through all of these questions within our time frame, we will reach back out and we will update the question and answer document, the frequently asked questions document, if we see that same question popping up over and over. The other thing I would ask is that to some of these questions, the answers are already in that frequently asked question document. So review that first. If you still have outstanding questions, again, we can try and update it. If we don't get back to you, feel free to send in a ticket to SPED data support. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Christopher Williams.
Thanks, Brandy. Thanks for that wonderful explanation. I really appreciate all that. So, as Brandy mentioned before, on May 1st, we will be pulling random samples and generating access codes for the IEP implementation data collection website. So the first frame that you see here, this is the landing page for the IEP implementation website. This is where you would enter your LEA level access code or your SELPA level access code. On May 1st, we'll be sending this out to SELPA directors. So they will be responsible for distributing that to all of their LEA representatives accordingly. So look for that. And SELPA directors, please be aware so that you can get the access codes to your LEA representatives in a timely manner so they have the full period of time to access their students and start their evaluation process. Okay, let's check the next slide. So again, May 3rd, you should see those access codes emailed out to the SELPA level users. And then once the SELPA level users log onto the system, there will be, I can show you on the next slide, or to download the access codes for the LEA level users. And again, it's the SELPA level's responsibility to distribute those timely to all of the LEA representatives accordingly. Okay, next slide. So once the SELPA representatives logged in from the screen that we saw above, this is your dashboard. This is what it will look like. On the right side of the frame, the top portion of that screen, you should see a link that says download LEA records. You'll need to click on that link And then from there, the next frame, or next slide rather, you'll see a list of the access codes for each of the LEAs. So then you can distribute these accordingly to the designee for each of those LEAs so that they can log in. Okay, and the next slide. So from your LEA view, once an LEA represents logged in, the left side of the frame is your LEA dashboard. So it'll show you a summary of your LEA information. It'll give you a frame on the right where you'll enter your summary data from the analysis of each of the 3 aggregate categories.
Chris, you're a little muffled. So if you could,
sorry. Let's try to get a
yeah.
little there.
No.
That's a little better. Sorry.
No, you're still muffled.
Technical issues. I'll try to speak a little louder. Is that any better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. So when you look in the upper right-hand frame, you'll see a link to download your student records, which from there you can access what you see to the right. Well, it'll be a list of student information, only providing the first letter of the last name, the first name, and then the student's SSID. From there, you can go in and begin your analysis process from the information we spoke about above, doing a summary review of how many service minutes were successfully implemented, making those calculations and determining then how many of those students fall into each of the categories. 95 to 100%, 90 to 94.9, or less than 90%. So once you've made the determination of how many of those students in your sample have fallen into each of those categories, you'd enter the total of those into the boxes that are on that bottom right frame. That total should be as close to possible to the actual sample that we provide. So say, for example, you're a large LEA, you have more than 500 students. We're going to give you a sample of 500. That sum total in all 3 boxes should add up to 500. If for some reason it doesn't and it's short by a few, say for instance, for reasons, there will be anomalies or reasons that where it may not, where your CalPEDS data wasn't updated and say a student left and you don't have that student's information and it's short by a few, you can still enter a total that's less than that 500, but provide an explanation to SELPA as to why, what happened, so that they understand. If it's an extraordinarily large amount that's less than the sample, then there could be a problem. So accurately enter those totals into those boxes. First, click the Save Data button. And then once you click the Save Data button, below that, there's a button that says Submit IEP Data. And once you click that, on the next slide, it'll show you where we land there from that on the website. So here will be the next screen. So once you've submitted your data as the LEA representative, you will need to certify your data or confirm this. So you would enter your information as the submitter, name, title, your email, contact, phone, and then below that, there's an acknowledgement that either on behalf of the superintendent or if you are the superintendent, that you're certifying that this data is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge. Once you have all the information entered, click the Submit IEP Implementation Data button. And please note, once you submit this, you wouldn't be able to go back and make changes to it. However, that's not the end of the world. Say, if after you clicked Submit, the SELPA does have the ability to reject your submission for you. If you had a reason that you wanted to make a change, you can go back and correct your submission and submit it again. And then SELPA would receive it again for approval. And then the next slide. So this would be once you have submitted your data, what you would see as an LEA. This is your dashboard. On the overview frame, which is an indicator that it's under review. Submission status would reflect it's awaiting SELPA review. And then your fields for the success rates would be grayed out and not able to be edited or changed at that point. Okay, so next slide. So as a SELPA representative, you need to keep up to date and keep constantly monitoring this website. Your dashboard is going to show you a summary of all the LEAs within your SELPA and their current status. So looking at this particular one, it shows that Palmdale Elementary has submitted their data and it's ready for review. That line for the LEAs, which is another indicator that's in pending status for review. Also, submission status shows a waiting review and when they submitted their data. So if you click as a self-representative on the review submission button, the next slide will show you what you'll see. So here it shows you the overview of that particular LEA that you're there to review. It shows you the summary of their IEP implementation success rates that they submitted. And from here, you can either approve or reject the submission. So if everything appears to be accurate, if it appears to be reasonable, say if they submitted 500 or if they submitted 498 out of that 500, that's reasonable. You can then approve the submission and click Save Data and go to Overview. Say, for instance, if there's a problem, they get 500 in their sample, but they only submitted 40 total. You can click the Reject Submission, type a note, say, hey, why is there only 40 out of 500 submitted? Once you click the Save Data, go to Overview, it will generate an email which gets sent to the LEA, but that's one kind of automated way to track this process, but you should follow up with them to see what's happening. Okay, and then the next slide. So for this example, this is an example where the data that they submitted looked accurate. The submission was approved. This frame in your SELPA interface, the dashboard shows submission was approved, the date that it was approved, and it's complete. So this particular dashboard example just shows one, but on yours you'll see a number of LEAs that would be in your SELPA. So please keep up to date, keep logging in during that submission process window to constantly check to make sure that they're getting their data in before the deadline is over. Sometimes we've seen instances where LEAs have submitted their data, but the SELPA hasn't followed up and it'll be in their pending, just waiting for your approval. So please try to keep up to date on those. Okay, next slide. So this is just a summary of our data validation requirements. So as we saw on that frame before submitting the data, that it's required that each superintendent or a designee of that superintendent for each LEA is certifying that data to the state that the LEA's implementation of IEP services are accurate and that school principals have certified to the LEA superintendent that such submitted data are accurate. And this is also to assess the validity and reliability of the data submitted in response to the state's annual statewide collection regarding LEA's implementation of IEP services. For those LEAs who submit such data, the state will randomly select 10% of those LEAs, as we described in the previous methodologies. And we would audit those data submitted with a follow-up survey. And if you are selected for that follow-up survey, the response to that is mandatory, and as Brandy mentioned before, it's only about a 5-minute survey, so please be on the lookout for that after the data collection is complete. Next slide. So the goals of this whole process, the statewide data collection, this is our efforts to help the state identify LEAs that are not implementing services that are promised in the students' IEPs, and also for us to help the LEAs program efficiency and effectiveness through monitoring their special education services that are provided to students across California. So that is the summary end of our presentation here. And then if you have questions, you can keep in contact with us. Please send emails to the email address IEPimplementation@cde.ca.gov. And I think we have more time we can address some of these questions that are in the Q&A box.
Okay. And also, for those of you, I've been typing in, SPED data support at CDE. Probably best if your questions are related to IEP implementation, using this email box, it will better help us streamline those questions. So yes. IEP implementation at cde.ca.gov. If one of my staff will please type that in the chat box, that would be amazing. So we can start at the top and start going down some of these questions. Also be aware, guys, that a lot of your questions are repetitive. So if we get to a point where I've already addressed the question, I'll just say it's already been addressed, and we'll move on to the next question. All right. Anonymous at 117, is this IEP data collection the fourth part of cycle B for this year? Not sure what you mean fourth part. This is, again, a separate requirement required by the court for monitoring. If this is sort of the fourth step in your cycle B monitoring process, I'm assuming that's what you mean. This is going to be a required component for cycle B small LEAs this year. Yeah. Anonymous at 118, are there any accommodations for absences for our medically fragile students? So currently, based on our numerator methodology, there was a slide that we included, and I will go back to it right now. If you just give me a second. Again, there are exclusions that we gave you. And so let me go back to the exclusion slide. These are the specific exclusions that we are including, this year. Field trips, scheduled breaks, testing periods, benchmark testing, special programming, and school-related emergencies. It currently does not include the exclusion that you're talking about, which is the medically fragile students. Students' absence counts against the LEA. Okay, so I've addressed this several times. Okay, Mary Tickle, the services prescribed include all of the various services combined? Yes, it does. Can attendance count when determining implementation rates for middle and high school? So are you asking whether or not, if you're asking whether or not you need to take attendance into account when determining the rates for middle and high school, I would say yes. And I apologize if I interpreted your question incorrectly. If I did, please go ahead and type in a clarification. Regarding slide 9, can you confirm the minutes in the numerator include minutes that would have been delivered but could not be? So the numerator, folks, numerator is what was received. How many minutes did the student actually receive? Janet, I think you're talking about the denominator. So the denominator includes all services prescribed. Okay, all services that were prescribed and how many minutes were prescribed during that period. And that includes, again, the minutes that were prescribed that the student received, the minutes that were prescribed that the student didn't receive due to student absences or staff absences. Okay, that's the denominator. But you can exclude, here on slide 9, the things at the bottom. And the reason those things at the bottom are excluded was because we want students with disabilities to have access to the same activities that their peers do. Or, if they're doing testing or statewide testing, benchmark testing, if there's a school emergency, you can exclude those from the denominator. Matthew Jensen at 119. Also, if there's an appropriately credentialed sub, do we need to count the teacher's absence in the denominator? No. If you're calculating SAI minutes, as long as there's an appropriately credentialed sub in the classroom, you can count those SAI minutes. Okay, Janet, regarding slide 13, when a student has push in or pull out SAI and the special education teacher is not the teacher of record, does attendance still count as proof of the delivery? If they're receiving those, well, so it depends on locally how you track your push in and pull out services. Okay, so if the student receives those minutes, then you can count them in the numerator. I hope that's your question. So again, we're not looking at teacher of record. We're just trying to determine how the student received those prescribed minutes. If they're pull out, push in, there has to be some way and some method that you guys are tracking, or that those individuals that are providing those pull in or push out services, or push in or pull out services, that they're tracking whether or not those minutes were received. Carrie at 122, what is the best way to document service not received to a school break of 5 days? Huh. You know, Carrie, that's a good question. Would you go ahead and just send that in as a question, because we can confer with some of our colleagues. So IEP implementation at cde.ca.gov. Okay. Anonymous at 122, if teacher union refuses to comply with the IEP services tracking and to be trained with the IEP implementation procedures, what can the LEA do? You know, honestly, I don't have a really good answer for this. Go ahead and send in a question. We can confer with some of your SELPA colleagues on recommendations for this. And I don't know whether or not, Heather DeFede, are you in the participant list? Because if you are, I'm gonna.
He is not.
She is not. Okay. And Benay, I know you were on earlier. I'm going to allow you to talk. So Benay, do you have any suggestions for this?
It is a challenge, and I think most of the districts have found a workaround in terms of having the identified individuals, like the students who are on the list, they collect it in a different format, like a Google Doc or whatever, some other format of collecting the data. So I think it is a challenge, and they have to work with their unit that this is a required activity. They should be collecting it no matter what. It's not that it's an extra duty. They should be collecting. They've always should have been collecting it. So that's just my 2 cents.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the input.
I can share, Brandy, that at SELPA, that was our directive as well, that since they are supposed to track this as a part of their normal routine, it's not additional.
Got it. Thanks, Dominic. Okay, Anonymous at 122, if transition services are built into SAI, how should we correctly report that on implementation? If my transition service shows as 0, but it was built in and actually delivered in full. So I'm assuming that this is probably a function of your special education data system, because it sounds like you're tracking this electronically through some sort of service tracker in one of the IEP systems like SACE or Cyrus. Dominic, are you aware of how you handled some of these situations?
For this, I think if the transition service is denoted as a separate service in the IEP, then they can just, if it was delivered as part of their normal SAI class time, then I would just mark it as delivered.
And so, but it sounds here like they embedded the transition services into the SAI service.
So if they did that, then they would not have a separate transition service on the IEP, so there would be nothing to enter for that.
Okay, so what you would recommend that they explicitly list it as a service? I mean,
typically they are anyway, you know, just for the other parts of the transition goals. So yeah, I would just suggest if that's built into the SAI minutes, since it can't be broken out in any meaningful way, I would just enter in the full delivery, as long, of course, as the student was present for all of those SAI sessions.
Great, thank you. Okay, Luke Dumont at 123. The challenges we are facing with IEP implementation in the past 2 years is chronic absenteeism. Yeah, it only takes a few students in the random sample who are chronically absent for our district to miss the IEP implementation target set by CDE. Also, for our district's largest demographic is Hispanic students. Many families who have children with disabilities are currently afraid to send their children to school for fear of ICE. So we are already aware and are working on the systemic challenges such as chronic absenteeism in our SIM plan, which has improved, but is still currently at 25%. So we recognize the challenges that we're facing currently. Again, this is an issue that comes up every year, and my understanding is that the department is not going to change its stance on the inclusion of student absences in the denominator. And again, it's not punitive. It's not intended to be punitive. And I understand your frustration, but it's not intended to be punitive. It's intended to identify issues, highlight issues, and so that CDE and your FMTA consultants can provide assistance. Okay. Winnie Lee at 123. Last year, we had student IEPs during the March-April window, but their services changed. For example, speech minutes were 25 2 times a week, and now speech minutes are 30 minutes 2 times a week. Do we provide an average between the 2 service minutes to reflect services that were provided to them? So, right, again, if during that period their prescribed services changed, you need to take into account all of those changes. So for the first half of the month, they were prescribed 25 minutes 2 times a week. Okay, so 50 minutes a week. Then it changes to 60. You have to add all of those up and then average them out. Yes.
One thing to be cognizant of when services change in the middle of the survey period is depending on your special education data system, but I know for SACE in particular, if updates are made to the services grid in the future IEP, you will no longer be able to deliver services or deliver minutes for that service in Service Tracker. So if you are having that change, make sure all deliveries are accounted for before making those changes on the services page.
Great tip, Dominic. Haley Jones at 125. Why are field trips, school breaks, testing, assemblies, or school emergencies not counted in the denominator, but student absences must be? So again, the reason that we have those other exclusions is because you want students with disabilities to have the same access to school activities as their general education peers. And then, of course, other things that are required by the state, such as testing, benchmark testing, all of those requirements, that can be excluded. School emergencies, they absolutely cannot be there. Student absences, again, it's just another one of those. It's a factor on why kids aren't receiving their services. Again, it's not intended to be punitive. Okay, Laura, send in information to SELPA. Oh, Carmen, you're on the small monitoring at cde.ca.gov. Thank you, Carmen. There is the small monitoring. If someone could take that and pop it in the chat. If you have, if you're small and you're not clear what cycle you're in, you can direct it to small monitoring. Okay, anonymous attendee, if services have a requirement of something like 100 minutes per year and are delivered before or after the implementation period, how do we correctly report that? I have some students that have OT or counseling services that are short-term or have a frequency like above, so they're not always being delivered during the implementation time. So number one, I would work with your SELPA to get input on how you should account for those things. So if they're prescribed 100 minutes per year and they don't receive it during that cycle because it's not scheduled during that cycle, I would confer with your SELPA to see how that could potentially be reported. I mean, if I'm just talking about it from a practical perspective, it looks like those services have not been delivered during that period. So I would confer with your SELPA. Okay, question. Why did CDE decide on these dates for data collection with ADL, SIMS, IEP implementation, school planning? Um, so when we looked at changing the dates of data collection, because this is another, we did kind of confer with the C3 committee on this, and really there is no ideal date, folks. There honestly isn't. And so we decided to keep the same window because any other dates that we thought about moving it to did not really work. So we decided to keep it the same this year. Slide 13 says student attendance meets SAI. So if the SPED teacher is also in attendance, there is no other documentation that is required. So if the student is in attendance and they're receiving their instruction, if it's a sub or, and so what I see what you're saying. So if that teacher was not available, really what we're talking about staff attendance is in cases where they, like, for example, the physical therapist, they were supposed to receive PT or OT, and that person was not available and there was no other staff available. It's those sorts of things. But if a student was in attendance, there was an appropriately credentialed or authorized or licensed or contracted individual in that spot that was substituting, then for SAI, you can count those minutes. Okay, Steve Perry. When calculating the denominator and attempting to exclude breaks or testing windows, what is recommended to back out services from annual or weekly types of services? Services provided is simple to calculate, but the total services will be more difficult to determine. So again, I would advise you, Steve, the calculation methods that you guys use locally are going to vary a lot depending on how you collect the data, all of the sources that you're using. So I would confer with your SELPA directors or your SELPA staff for advice on these specific calculation methodologies. Okay, Anonymous at 129. What about for student chronic absenteeism? I agree. It feels like we're being dinged for this, and I've covered this. Okay. For students receiving weekly services or all minutes, especially SAI and behavior intervention services still required during parent conference week when there are minimum days for an entire week, as well as 3 to 4 day weeks. You know what, Anonymous, if you could just send this question into IEP implementation, we can confer internally and talk about this. Laura White, does it all go to the SELPA users or a specific title within the LEA? Chris, can you answer that question? So,
this would be out to the SELPA director that's on contact right now on record.
So it's really important if you have changes to your SELPA directors, if you've had changes, please make sure you let us know that that has happened, because we can forward that change in SELPA director to the internal database, our county district school database, to make sure that that's updated. Okay, yes. So we'll go to your SELPA. It will go to your SELPA directors based on what's currently in our county district school database.
And please update that, like Randy said, because it happens often where that changes and we don't get defined, so we end up sending it to the old contact, and that just causes a delay for everyone in the process. But and someone asked within the questions below to re-emphasize that, make sure that the SELPA, if you're a SELPA director, once you get these access codes on May 1st, please be sure to send those out timely to your LEA representatives so that they can get a start on doing these evaluations and summary calculations, so that they have the maximum amount of time to complete that during this reporting period. Thanks.
Okay, Matthew at 137, if a sub is present and servicing students, does this count as minutes not delivered? Okay, again, if you have an appropriately contracted, certificated staff person providing SAI and the student is present, you can count that as a service received. Carrie Novo at 138, will absences due to state testing count as an absence or will it be included? Okay, so that's one of our exclusions. So you can exclude that from the denominator. Okay, so I'm going to take questions for about another 10 minutes. So we'll see if we can get down as far as we can. Can you reiterate to SELPAs that they are to provide our access codes, please? Last year, there was a lot of confusion from our SELPA about who had codes when we asked for them, which caused a delay for us to get going on these data. Who should be notified about SELPA director change? You can send, if you've had a SELPA director change, just feel free to send it into the IEP implementation at cde.ca.gov. Totally fine that you do that. We can forward that to the powers that be that can update that database, but make sure that you let us know. One of the primary reasons that there are these delays is because we send those emails to the contact that we have on file. That person's no longer there, then you don't get the access codes. So please just make sure that you're updating your SELPA directors if you've had a change within the last academic year. What about suspension? So again, if the student is not there, is not receiving services, and it also depends on the duration, folks, because remember that if kids have been cumulatively suspended for more than 10 days, you're required to provide their IEP services. So if it's, let's say, a 3-day suspension, the student didn't receive services during that time, that would count in the denominator, but not in the numerator. Okay, so can you go over absenteeism again? So what I will say is if you would refer to our frequently asked questions document, we cover why absences are included. So if you could refer to the frequently asked questions document, that is in there, and I've covered it a few times. To confirm, the LEA is affected by fires. Should they be using school-related emergencies or excused school absence? So if you were not able to provide services and you're still not able to provide services during the evaluation period, folks, okay? So if for whatever reason services are being affected by that, then, or there are other school-related emergencies, you can exclude those from the denominator. Okay, so many LEA SELPAs, this is Carrie, many LEA SELPAs have created some amazing spreadsheets and procedures surrounding IEP implementation reporting. Is there a mechanism for sharing resources with each other? And so there were a couple of colleagues. Also, I know that Heather DeFeedy from one of the San Diego SELPAs in East County, I believe she's from East County. I believe she's created some processes for this and resources. So
Heather, sorry,
go ahead.
Heather's here now.
Oh, she's here.
Yeah, somebody put up the bat signal and she responded.
Okay, Heather, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot here. So Heather, do you have any recommendations for resources or on processes?
Yes, I do. I'll make sure the SELPA directors have them. We've done a lot of how to audit before you get to the implementation window. So I have all of those resources. And then just as far as the calculation, I worked with Scott Gutman out of Fontana. So we do have that calculator tool. I believe some of the SEDS systems do have that uploaded within their their system somewhere. So that's also a tool you can use to help you figure out all of those things. But there's a lot of auditing you can do between your 16.5 reports and also with your own internal special ed data systems that you can look at now to start auditing. But I'll dust off that the IEP implementation audits and make sure that the SELPAs get it at our meeting next week when we do our C3 report.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay. Haley, can you discuss again how the ADL IEP implementation is tied to this process and what the LEA must do if they're not in compliance? So the LEAs that were flagged for IEP implementation in the annual determination letter was any LEA where more than 50% of that student sample was put in the bucket as receiving less than 90%. So we talked about the three categories, A, B, and C. So more than 50% of their sample fell in category C. Okay, that if so, you were flagged with IEP implementation. And LEAs that were flagged for IEP implementation are required to do the data drill down. They're supposed to do the data drill down tool through SIL's website that were in the Improvement Data Center. Okay, anonymous at 149, the court does not indicate that student absences should be included, correct? So why is the state including that when services are not required when the student is absent? So again, we are for this year, student absences should be included. So, and I apologize. I know that there are lots of you that are probably going to have the same question, but it's been addressed several times. So, and I want to get through as many questions as possible. If a student is present in class, but refuses to go to a prescribed service, do those minutes still go in the numerator, or do we not count them? So Ronald, I would ask that you go to our frequently asked questions because I believe there's an FAQ that specifically addresses student refusal. Since makeup services are not required when a student is absent, how is it relevant to track failure to implement services when a student is absent? Okay. What about justice engaged students who sometimes bounce back between homeschool and juvenile, which is a different LEA during the time period? Again, if a student is not continuously enrolled through the entire period, primary enrollment, and they're enrolled during that entire period, you do not have to review that student's IEP. Anonymous at 153, does the CDE have a plan for developing an automated monitoring system, a statewide system of tracking services and absences that doesn't require each individual LEA to go through this process independently? To my knowledge, we have no current plans to implement a state level service tracking system, although I think it's a great idea. Anonymous 156, how many years are left on this monitoring for the lawsuit? Does it ever end? You know, to my knowledge, I don't think there's a sunset date. Anonymous at 156, if it is not supposed to be punitive, then why are we required to do more? Why are we required to do more reporting as a causation? I'm assuming you're referring to the IEP implementation data collection, or I'm not sure I understand that question. So if you want to provide more clarification, I can try and answer it. Okay, anonymous at 156, the comment. Anonymous at 157, if our target was not met last year, IEP implementation should be part of our SIM plan? So that's a good question. As far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, LEAs are required, LEAs that did not meet the target for IEP implementation based on their 23-24 data collection results are required to do the data drill down. Whether or not it has to be part of your SIM plan, I can't answer that question specifically, but we can certainly send that question to our FUMTA team if you want to submit that question to the IEP implementation email box. Okay, folks, so we are at 2:15. And I am going to ask for the rest of you whose questions that we did not address, please, if you will take those questions and send them to the IEP implementation at cde.ca.gov email address. I will have my staff reach out to you and respond to you directly. So I apologize for not being able to get through all of these questions. I hope that this session was informative. And as you go through this process, if you encounter issues, again, reach out to IEP implementation at cde.ca.gov. We will try and help you with anything that you need help with. Otherwise, look forward to getting those access codes on or about May 3rd. Your SELPA should get them out to you. So thanks for joining us today. And we will send out a message to all of those that registered, as well as all those on the SPED data support listserv when the video is available for viewing. And that should hopefully be within the next week or so. So thanks very much, you guys. Have a great afternoon.